Dr. Sarah Chen had been working as a forensic age progression specialist for the FBI for 12 years, but the photograph that landed on her desk that crisp October morning would challenge everything she thought she knew about the passage of time and human biology. The image had been submitted by Detective Marcus Reynolds from the Portland Police Bureau as part of a missing persons investigation that had taken an impossible turn. The photograph showed two young women, clearly sisters, standing in what appeared to be a well-maintained garden. They wore modern clothing that suggested the photo had been taken recently, perhaps within the last few years. Both women appeared to be in their early 20s, with the same distinctive facial structure, similar hair color, and matching smiles that spoke of a close sibling relationship. What made this seemingly ordinary family photograph extraordinary was the accompanying documentation that Detective Reynolds had provided. According to his files, the woman on the left was Charlotte Whitmore, age 23, who had been reported missing by her family 6 weeks ago. The woman on the right was her sister Emma Whitmore, who would have been 26 years old when this photograph was taken. Would have been, because according to police records, Emma Whitmore had died in a car accident 17 years ago when she was 26 years old. Sarah examined the photograph more closely, using the high-resolution scanner and enhancement software that made her one of the most sought-after specialists in forensic imaging. The detail quality was excellent, clearly taken with a modern digital camera. Both women appeared healthy, happy, and very much alive. There were no signs of digital manipulation, no telltale artifacts that would suggest the image had been altered or that one of the faces had been superimposed from an older photograph. More troubling still, Emma Whitmore's appearance in the recent photograph was identical to how she had looked at the time of her death 17 years earlier. While her sister Charlotte showed the normal signs of aging from a teenager to a young adult, Emma appeared frozen, at exactly the same age she had been when she died. Sarah reached for her phone and dialed Detective Reynolds' number. When he answered, she could hear the tension in his voice that suggested he had been waiting for her call. "Detective Reynolds, this is Dr. Chen. I've had a chance to examine the photograph you sent me. Before we discuss my findings, I need to understand the context better. How did this image come to your attention?" Reynolds cleared his throat before responding. "It's part of a missing persons case that's become increasingly bizarre. Charlotte Whitmore disappeared 6 weeks ago from her apartment in Portland. No signs of struggle, no indication of foul play, but she simply vanished. Her parents contacted us when she failed to show up for work and didn't respond to calls or messages." Sarah pulled up the case file on her computer as Reynolds continued speaking. "During our investigation, we discovered this photograph on Charlotte's laptop. According to the metadata, it was taken just 3 days before she disappeared. The problem is, Dr. Chen, that the woman standing next to Charlotte in this photo died in 2007. I've personally verified Emma Whitmore's death certificate, autopsy report, and burial records." The implications of what Reynolds was describing sent a chill through Sarah's professional composure. In her years of forensic work, she had encountered cases involving mistaken identity, fraudulent documentation, and even elaborate hoaxes designed to collect insurance money or escape legal troubles, but she had never seen evidence suggesting that someone had returned from the dead, looking exactly as they had 17 years earlier. "Detective Reynolds, have you been able to verify the location where this photograph was taken?" "That's another strange aspect of this case," Reynolds replied. "The garden in the background appears to be the Whitmore family's backyard, but according to Charlotte's parents, that garden was destroyed years ago when they renovated their property. The plants, the stone pathway, even the distinctive arbor visible in the photograph were all removed in 2019. Sarah enhanced the background of the photograph, examining the garden details that Reynolds had mentioned. The landscaping was indeed elaborate and well-established, suggesting years of careful cultivation. The stone pathway showed signs of age and weathering, and the climbing roses on the arbor appeared to be mature specimens that would have taken considerable time to develop. "Has anyone checked the current state of the Whitmore family property?" "Yes, we visited the property last week. The backyard looks completely different now. It's mostly lawn with a few young trees that were planted during the renovation. There's no trace of the garden shown in this photograph." Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing the impossible elements of the case. a woman photographed with her sister 3 days before disappearing, standing in a garden that no longer existed, next to a sibling who had been dead for 17 years but appeared unchanged by the passage of time. Detective Reynolds, I need to examine the original digital files from Charlotte's laptop, and I'd like to speak with the Whitmore family directly. There are aspects of this case that require more detailed investigation than I can provide from photographs alone. I was hoping you'd say that, Reynolds responded with obvious relief. The Whitmore family has been cooperative, but they're understandably distressed by these developments. They've agreed to meet with you, if it might help us find Charlotte. The flight to Portland gave Sarah time to research the Whitmore family history and the circumstances surrounding Emma's death in 2007. According to newspaper reports, Emma had been driving home from her job at a local photography studio when her car skidded on wet pavement and collided with a tree. She had been pronounced dead at the scene, and her funeral had been attended by hundreds of friends and family members. Emma had been an aspiring photographer with a particular interest in portrait work and botanical photography. Several local galleries had featured her work, and she had been planning to open her own studio before her untimely death. The irony that the mysterious photograph at the center of the current investigation showed such professional composition and lighting was not lost on Sarah. Charlotte, 17 at the time of her sister's death, had reportedly been devastated by the loss. According to family friends interviewed by the local newspaper, Charlotte had been extremely close to Emma and had struggled with depression and anxiety in the years following the accident. She had eventually moved away from Portland for college, returning only recently to take a job as a graphic designer. Detective Reynolds met Sarah at the Portland airport, a tall man in his 40s with the tired eyes of someone who had seen too many cases that defied easy explanation. During the drive to the Whitmore family home, he provided additional details that made the case even more perplexing. We've canvassed Charlotte's neighborhood, interviewed her co-workers, and checked all the usual places someone might go if they were having personal problems. There's no indication she was planning to leave town, no unusual financial transactions, no contact with old friends or romantic interests. She simply vanished, leaving behind this impossible photograph as the only clue. The Whitmore family lived in a comfortable suburban neighborhood, their house a well-maintained colonial style that suggested middle-class stability. Robert and Margaret Whitmore, both in their 60s, met them at the front door with the strained expressions of parents who had endured far more tragedy than any family should face. Margaret Whitmore, a small woman with graying hair and intelligent eyes, led them into the living room where family photographs covered nearly every surface. Sarah noticed immediately that the photos seemed to fall into two distinct periods. Those taken before 2007 showed a happy family of 4, while those from later years showed only 3 family members, with Emma's absence creating a palpable void in the family compositions. Mrs. Whitmore, Detective Reynolds said gently, Dr. Chen is a forensic specialist who may be able to help us understand the photograph we found on Charlotte's computer. She'd like to ask you some questions about your daughters and the garden shown in the image. Margaret nodded, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Anything that might help us find Charlotte. We've already lost Emma, and the thought of losing Charlotte too is unbearable. Sarah pulled out a printed copy of the mysterious photograph and placed it on the coffee table. Mrs. Whitmore, when you look at this image, what strikes you as unusual besides the obvious fact that Emma appears to be in it? Margaret studied the photograph carefully, her expression shifting from grief to confusion to something approaching fear. The garden, she said finally. This is our old garden, the one we had before the renovation. But Charlotte was only 17 when we removed all of these plants. She was away at college when we redesigned the backyard. Sarah made notes as Margaret continued speaking. And Emma, she loved that garden. She spent hours photographing the flowers, especially the roses climbing on that arbor. She always said she wanted to be buried somewhere with flowers like those. Do you have any of Emma's photographs from the garden? Margaret left the room and returned with a leather portfolio filled with Emma's botanical photography. The images were indeed professional quality, showing an artistic eye for composition and lighting. Most relevant were several self-portraits Emma had taken in the garden, using a timer or remote shutter to capture herself among the flowers she loved. Sarah compared Emma's self-portraits to the recent photograph of the two sisters. The resemblance was unmistakable, But what struck her most was the identical nature of Emma's appearance across a 17-year time span. Not just similar, but absolutely identical, down to the same slight smile, the same way her hair caught the light, even the same small scar on her left hand that was visible in both the old and new photographs. "Mrs. Whitmore," Sarah said carefully, "I need to ask you about Charlotte's mental state in the months before she disappeared. Had she been acting unusually? Talking about Emma more than usual, perhaps experiencing any kind of psychological distress?" Margaret exchanged a look with her husband before responding. Charlotte had been seeing a therapist for the past year. She'd been having vivid dreams about Emma, claiming that her sister was trying to communicate with her. At first, we thought it was just grief resurfacing, perhaps triggered by the anniversary of Emma's death. But the dreams became more frequent and more detailed. What kind of details? According to Charlotte, Emma was telling her about a place where time worked differently, where people who died young could continue living if they had strong enough connections to the world they left behind. Charlotte became convinced that Emma was still alive somewhere, waiting for her to find a way to reach her. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she recognized elements of near-death experience accounts and various religious beliefs about the afterlife. But the existence of the photograph suggested that Charlotte's experiences might have been more than simple grief-induced hallucinations. Robert Whitmore, who had remained silent during most of the conversation, suddenly spoke up. "There's something else you should know. 3 weeks before Charlotte disappeared, she started gardening. She planted roses and other flowers in our backyard, trying to recreate the old garden. She said Emma had told her in a dream that the garden was important, that it was some kind of doorway." Detective Reynolds and Sarah exchanged significant looks. If Charlotte had been attempting to recreate the garden from the photograph, it suggested a level of planning and intention behind her disappearance that went beyond a simple missing persons case. "Can we see the current backyard?" Sarah asked. They walked through the house to the back door, which opened onto a large lawn dotted with newly planted flower beds. The landscaping was clearly in its early stages, with small plants and saplings that would take years to mature into anything resembling the garden from the photograph. But what caught Sarah's attention were the roses. Despite having been planted only weeks earlier, the rose bushes were blooming with an abundance that seemed impossible for such young plants. The flowers were identical to those visible in the mysterious photograph, their deep red color and distinctive petal formation matching exactly. Margaret noticed Sarah's attention on the roses. Those bloomed 3 days after Charlotte planted them. "I've been gardening for 30 years and I've never seen anything like it. It's as if they were already mature when she put them in the ground." Sarah knelt beside one of the rose bushes, examining the soil and root system. The plants appeared healthy and well-established, but the soil around them showed clear signs of recent disturbance. It was as if the roses had been transplanted as mature specimens rather than planted as young bushes. "Mrs. Whitmore, did Charlotte say where she obtained these particular roses?" Margaret shook her head. "She just appeared with them one morning, saying she'd found them at a special nursery. But when I asked which one, she became evasive and changed the subject." As they returned to the house, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from her laboratory assistant back in Washington. The digital analysis of Charlotte's laptop files had been completed, and there were anomalies in the metadata that required immediate attention. During the drive back to downtown Portland, Sarah called her lab to discuss the findings. What her assistant reported made the case even more mysterious. The photograph file showed creation dates and camera settings that were technically impossible, given the image quality and resolution. The metadata suggested the photo had been taken with camera technology that didn't exist at the time the file claimed to have been created. More disturbing was the discovery that the photograph wasn't the only unusual file on Charlotte's laptop. Hidden in a rarely accessed folder were dozens of other images that appeared to show Emma in various locations around Portland, all taken within the past 6 months. In each photograph, Emma looked exactly as she had at the time of her death, unchanged by the 17 years that had passed. Detective Reynolds listened to Sarah's explanation with growing alarm. If Charlotte had been taking photographs of someone who looked like her deceased sister for months before her disappearance, it suggested either an elaborate hoax involving an Emma lookalike or something far more unsettling. "Dr. Chen," Reynolds said as they parked outside the Portland Police Bureau, "I need to show you something else. We found additional evidence at Charlotte's apartment that we haven't shared with the family yet. In the evidence room, Reynolds led Sarah to a table covered with items collected from Charlotte's apartment. Among the usual personal belongings were several items that seemed out of place. Antique photography equipment, including a vintage camera from the 1920s, several old botanical reference books, and a journal filled with Charlotte's handwriting. Sarah opened the journal and began reading Charlotte's final entries. The writing revealed a young woman's growing obsession with reaching her deceased sister, documenting detailed instructions for what she called temporal photography sessions. According to Charlotte's notes, she had been attempting to use specific camera equipment and photographic techniques to capture images of people who existed in what she termed parallel time streams. The journal entries became increasingly erratic as they approached the date of Charlotte's disappearance, describing successful contact with Emma and plans for a final photographic session that would allow them to be reunited permanently. The last entry, dated 2 days before Charlotte vanished, contained a single line. "Tomorrow, Emma will show me how to step through." Sarah photographed the relevant journal pages and examined the vintage camera equipment. The items appeared authentic to their claimed time period, but she noticed modifications that wouldn't have been possible with 1920s technology. Someone had added modern electronic components while maintaining the vintage appearance. "Detective Reynolds, have you been able to trace where Charlotte acquired this equipment?" "We tried, but the trail goes cold. The camera shop where she allegedly purchased some of these items has no record of the transactions, and the equipment itself doesn't match anything in their inventory." Sarah spent the rest of the day examining Charlotte's apartment, looking for any additional clues that might explain her disappearance or the origins of the impossible photographs. The apartment was neat and organized, showing no signs of struggle or hurried departure. But in Charlotte's bedroom, Sarah discovered something that made her reconsider everything she thought she understood about the case. Hidden behind a loose baseboard was a small collection of letters, written in Emma's handwriting and apparently sent to Charlotte over the past year. The letters described Emma's existence in what she called the in-between place, a realm where time moved differently and where people who died with strong earthly connections could continue to exist. According to Emma's letters, she had been trying to contact Charlotte for years, but had only recently discovered how to bridge the gap between their different states of existence. The photographic sessions Charlotte had been conducting were apparently Emma's attempts to manifest visually in Charlotte's world, gradually building the strength necessary for more substantial contact. The final letter, dated 1 week before Charlotte's disappearance, contained detailed instructions for a ritual that would allow Charlotte to join Emma permanently. The process involved recreating their childhood garden using specific photographic equipment to capture what Emma called temporal echoes, and performing the ritual at a time when the barrier between worlds was thinnest. Sarah photographed the letters and returned to her hotel room to analyze everything she had discovered. The evidence painted a picture of two sisters whose bond had transcended death, with one trying desperately to reach the other across the boundaries of mortality. But it also raised disturbing questions about Charlotte's mental state and whether she had been manipulated by someone posing as her deceased sister. That evening, Sarah received a call from Margaret Whitmore. The older woman's voice was shaking with excitement and fear as she described what had happened in their backyard that afternoon. "Dr. Chen, you need to come back here immediately. Something's happening in the garden Charlotte planted. The roses are glowing, and I swear I can see figures moving among the flowers." Sarah drove back to the Whitmore house through the Portland suburbs, noting how the familiar neighborhood seemed different in the darkness, as if the normal rules of reality were somehow suspended. When she arrived, she found Margaret and Robert standing at their back door, staring out at their backyard, with expressions of wonder and terror. The garden that Charlotte had attempted to recreate was indeed glowing with a soft, ethereal light that seemed to emanate from the roses themselves. The newly planted flowers had somehow grown and spread during the day, creating a miniature version of the garden from the mysterious photograph. And moving among the luminous blooms were two female figures, barely visible, but unmistakably human in form. Sarah joined the Whitmores at the back door, her scientific training warring with the evidence of her own eyes. The figures in the garden moved with the fluid grace of people underwater, their forms shifting and changing as if they existed partially in the visible world and partially somewhere else entirely. As they watched, one of the figures turned toward the house and waved. Even at a distance and despite the ethereal nature of the apparition, Sarah could see that it was Charlotte. The missing young woman appeared happy and peaceful, her face radiant with joy as she gestured for her parents to see her. Beside Charlotte stood another figure that could only be Emma, looking exactly as she had in the photographs, unchanged by death or the passage of time. The sisters held hands as they moved through the garden, occasionally pointing at different flowers or looking up at the night sky with expressions of wonder. Margaret Whitmore began crying softly as she watched her daughters together in the impossible garden. "They look so happy," she whispered. "They look like they did when they were children, playing in the original garden before everything changed." Sarah pulled out her phone and began recording the phenomenon, though she doubted that the device would capture what they were seeing. The figures in the garden seemed to exist in a wavelength of reality that normal technology couldn't detect or reproduce. As if responding to her attempt to document them, both sisters turned toward the house again. Charlotte raised her hand and pressed it against what appeared to be an invisible barrier, her mouth moving as if trying to speak. Though no sound reached them, Sarah could read her lips. "Thank you for helping them understand." Emma also approached the barrier, and for a moment her form became more solid and visible. She placed her hand against the same invisible surface where Charlotte's hand rested, and suddenly Margaret Whitmore gasped. "I can hear her," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. "Emma is telling me that they're together now, that Charlotte chose to join her in the place where time doesn't separate people who love each other. She says they're happy, and that we shouldn't grieve for them because they'll be waiting for us when our time comes." The ethereal garden began to fade as the first hints of dawn appeared in the eastern sky. The glowing roses returned to their normal appearance, and the two sisters became increasingly translucent until they vanished entirely, leaving only the scent of roses hanging in the morning air. Sarah remained with the Whitmore family through the sunrise, helping them process what they had experienced and discussing the implications for the missing persons investigation. From a legal standpoint, Charlotte Whitmore remained a missing person whose disappearance couldn't be explained through conventional means. But for her parents, the supernatural reunion they had witnessed provided a form of closure that no police investigation could offer. Detective Reynolds arrived later that morning to take statements about the overnight events. His skepticism was evident, but he couldn't dispute the physical evidence. The garden that had grown impossibly overnight, the lingering scent of roses in areas where no roses had been planted, and the strange electromagnetic readings his equipment detected in the backyard. "Doctor." "Chen," Reynolds said as they prepared to leave the Whitmore property, "what's your professional opinion about what we've witnessed here?" Sarah considered her response carefully. "From a forensic standpoint, we have documented evidence of phenomena that can't be explained through conventional scientific methods. The photographs, the rapid plant growth, the electromagnetic anomalies all suggest that we're dealing with something beyond our normal understanding of reality." She paused, looking back at the garden where Charlotte had last been seen alive. Whether Charlotte Whitmore is technically alive or dead according to legal definitions may be less important than the fact that she appears to have found the reunion with her sister that she was seeking. Sometimes the most compassionate response to an impossible situation is to accept that our knowledge has limitations. The official case file listed Charlotte Whitmore as a missing person, whose disappearance remained unsolved, but Detective Reynolds included a confidential addendum describing the supernatural elements of the case, creating a record that might help future investigators who encountered similar phenomena. Sarah returned to Washington with copies of all the evidence, including the photographs, journal entries, and video recordings of the ethereal garden. Her colleagues at the FBI were skeptical of her reports, but the documentation was too extensive and detailed to dismiss entirely. She continued to monitor the case from a distance, staying in contact with the Whitmore family and Detective Reynolds. Margaret and Robert Whitmore reported that their garden continued to bloom with unusual abundance, and that they occasionally caught glimpses of their daughters moving among the flowers during twilight hours. 6 months later, Sarah received a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph of Charlotte and Emma, standing in a vast garden that extended beyond the frame of the image. Both sisters looked radiantly happy, and in the background, Sarah could see other figures, other families, who had apparently been reunited across the boundaries of mortality. Attached to the photograph was a note in Charlotte's handwriting. "Dr. Chen, thank you for helping our parents understand. The garden grows larger every day, and there's room for everyone who believes that love is stronger than the passage of time. When your time comes, look for the roses." Sarah kept the photograph in her desk drawer at the FBI, a reminder that some missing persons cases transcend the normal boundaries of life and death. She never publicly discussed the supernatural elements of the Whitmore case, but she began paying closer attention to missing persons reports that involved family members claiming contact with deceased relatives. Over the following years, she encountered several other cases with similar elements: family photographs showing deceased relatives, witnesses reporting contact with missing persons who claimed to exist in parallel time streams, and gardens or other locations where the normal rules of time and mortality seemed suspended. Each case reinforced Sarah's growing belief that human consciousness might persist beyond physical death in ways that science hadn't yet learned to measure or understand. The love between Charlotte and Emma Whitmore had apparently created a bridge between worlds, allowing them to maintain their sisterly bond despite the intervention of death. The Whitmore garden became something of a local legend in Portland, with neighbors reporting unusual phenomena and occasional sightings of the two sisters among the flowers. The property was never sold, and Margaret and Robert Whitmore spent their remaining years tending the garden that had become a portal to their daughter's continuing existence. When Margaret Whitmore passed away peacefully in her sleep 3 years later, witnesses at her funeral reported seeing 3 female figures moving through the garden during the memorial service. Robert died 6 months after his wife, and neighbors claimed that all 4 family members were visible in the garden on the anniversary of Charlotte's disappearance. The house now stands empty, but the garden continues to bloom with impossible abundance. Local photographers have attempted to capture the ethereal figures that are occasionally seen among the roses, but their cameras record only empty garden space, as if the reunited family exists in a wavelength of reality that technology cannot access. Sarah kept detailed files on the Whitmore case and others like it, creating an unofficial database of supernatural missing persons cases that challenged conventional understanding of life, death, and the persistence of human consciousness. She never found scientific explanations for the phenomena she documented, but she came to believe that some human bonds are strong enough to transcend the physical limitations of mortality. The photograph of Charlotte and Emma in their impossible garden remained in Sarah's desk drawer, a reminder that love might indeed be the most powerful force in the universe, capable of bridging any gap, transcending any boundary, and reuniting souls across the vast spaces between worlds. And sometimes, when Sarah worked late into the night at her FBI office, she could swear she smelled the scent of roses, as if the Whitmore sisters' garden extended its influence even into the corridors of federal law enforcement. The case officially remained unsolved, but for those who had witnessed the supernatural reunion, it represented something far more important than closure: proof that death might not be the final separation, and that sisters who love each other deeply enough might find ways to remain together regardless of the obstacles that time and mortality place in their path. But the story of the Whitmore sisters was far from over. 2 years after Charlotte's disappearance, Sarah received another call from Detective Reynolds. His voice carried the same mixture of professional skepticism and supernatural unease that she had come to associate with cases that defied conventional explanation. "Dr. Chen, we have another situation that appears connected to the Whitmore case. A family in Seattle contacted us after seeing news coverage about Charlotte's disappearance. They claim to have evidence that their missing daughter has been in contact with the Whitmore sisters. The Seattle case involved 19-year-old Lisa Martinez, who had vanished from her college dormitory 3 months earlier. Like Charlotte, Lisa had left behind no indication of her plans to disappear, but her laptop contained dozens of photographs that appeared to show deceased family members in impossible circumstances. Sarah flew to Seattle the next day, meeting Detective Reynolds at the Martinez family home in a quiet residential neighborhood north of the city. The family's story paralleled the Whitmore case in disturbing ways. Lisa had been experiencing vivid dreams about her deceased grandmother, claiming that the elderly woman was trying to communicate important information about family members who had died over the past several decades. Maria Martinez, Lisa's mother, showed Sarah through their modest home while explaining her daughter's increasingly erratic behavior in the weeks before her disappearance. Lisa had always been close to her grandmother, Eleanor, who had raised her during her early childhood, while Maria worked multiple jobs to support the family. Elena Martinez had died 5 years earlier after a lengthy battle with cancer, but according to Maria, Lisa had never fully accepted her grandmother's death. She would often speak to Elena's photograph as if the elderly woman could hear her, and she claimed to receive answers through dreams and what she called intuitive impressions. The situation had escalated dramatically 6 months before Lisa's disappearance, when she began claiming that Elena was showing her visions of other deceased family members in a place that sounded remarkably similar to the ethereal realm described in Charlotte's journal entries. According to Lisa's own notes, which Maria shared with Sarah, Elena had explained that certain people who died with strong family connections could continue to exist in what she called the gathering place, a realm where souls waited for their loved ones to join them. The condition for entering this realm was simple but demanding. A living person had to love their deceased family member deeply enough to choose reunion over continued earthly existence. Sarah examined Lisa's laptop, finding hundreds of digital images that appeared to show the young woman in conversation with her deceased grandmother. The photographs had been taken over a period of months, always in the Martinez family's backyard garden, and they showed Lisa apparently speaking with an invisible companion, whose presence was suggested only by Lisa's focused attention and emotional responses. But mixed among these images were several that showed both Lisa and Elena clearly visible, the elderly woman appearing exactly as she had at the time of her death. Most unsettling was a series of photographs taken just days before Lisa's disappearance, showing not only Lisa and Elena, but also 2 other young women who bore a striking resemblance to Charlotte and Emma Whitmore. Detective Reynolds had enhanced these images using police forensic software, and the resemblance to the Whitmore sisters was unmistakable. The photographs suggested that Lisa had somehow made contact with Charlotte and Emma in their ethereal realm, and that the 3 young women had formed connections that transcended the normal boundaries between the living and the dead. Maria Martinez led Sarah to the backyard where these impossible photographs had been taken. Like the Whitmore garden, the space showed signs of supernatural influence. Plants that had grown far beyond their normal size and seasonal patterns, flowers that bloomed in impossible combinations, and an overall sense of ethereal beauty that seemed too perfect to occur naturally. But what caught Sarah's attention immediately was a new addition to the garden that hadn't been present when Lisa lived at home. In the center of the flowering space stood a small stone monument, carved with names and dates that documented 3 generations of Martinez family deaths. According to Maria, Lisa had commissioned the monument just weeks before her disappearance, claiming that Eleanor had requested a physical marker to help other family members find their way to the gathering place. "Dr. Chen," Maria said as they stood before the monument, "Lisa left us a letter explaining her decision. She said she couldn't bear to live without Elena any longer, and that her grandmother had shown her a way to be reunited, not just with her, but with all of our family members who had passed away over the years." Sarah read Lisa's farewell letter, which described her experiences in the ethereal realm with remarkable clarity and detail. According to Lisa, the gathering place was a vast garden where time moved differently and where family bonds created the landscape itself. Deceased relatives continued to exist there in the forms they had possessed at the moments of their death, but they retained all of their memories and personalities from their earthly lives. Most significantly, Lisa wrote that Charlotte and Emma Whitmore had become her guides in learning how to navigate between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The 3 young women had discovered that their shared experience of deep grief over lost family members created a resonance that allowed them to communicate across dimensional boundaries. Lisa's letter concluded with detailed instructions for her parents about maintaining the garden that served as a portal between worlds. She explained that the monument she had commissioned would serve as an anchor point for other family members who might choose to join the gathering place in the future, and that her parents would occasionally be able to see her among the flowers during times when the barriers between worlds were thinnest. Sarah spent several days in Seattle, documenting the Martinez family's experiences and comparing them to the evidence she had collected in the Whitmore case. The similarities were too numerous and specific to be coincidental. Both families had lost beloved members who had maintained strong emotional connections to the deceased. Both had experienced supernatural contact through dreams and visions, and both had witnessed the creation of ethereal gardens that served as portals to an otherworldly realm. More troubling was Sarah's discovery that the Martinez case was not unique. Her research into missing persons reports from across the Pacific Northwest revealed at least 6 other cases involving young adults who had disappeared under similar circumstances, always leaving behind evidence of contact with deceased family members and claims about finding ways to reunite with lost loved ones. Each case followed the same pattern: a period of increasing supernatural contact, attempts to recreate physical spaces associated with deceased family members, and final disappearances that left families with both grief and hope that their missing relatives had achieved the reunions they sought. Sarah began to suspect that some form of supernatural network was operating across the region, connecting families who had experienced profound losses and offering them the possibility of reunions that transcended death. The evidence suggested that certain individuals who died with strong family bonds could somehow maintain consciousness in an alternate realm, and that living relatives with sufficient emotional connection could be recruited to join them. The implications were both beautiful and terrifying. If the gathered evidence was accurate, death might not be the absolute ending that science and medicine understood it to be, but the cost of accessing this continued existence appeared to be the willing abandonment of normal human life, a choice that could only be made by individuals whose grief over lost family members outweighed their attachment to earthly existence. Sarah's investigation took on new urgency when she received reports of similar phenomena occurring in other parts of the country. The supernatural network that had originated in the Pacific Northwest appeared to be expanding, with missing persons cases in California, Colorado, and even as far east as North Carolina showing identical patterns of family contact with deceased relatives and subsequent disappearances. Each new case added layers of complexity to what Sarah had initially believed was an isolated phenomenon. The Whitmore sisters, rather than being unique victims of supernatural circumstances, appeared to be part of a growing community of individuals who had chosen reunion with deceased family members over continued earthly existence. Sarah's FBI supervisors grew increasingly concerned about her investigation as the number of connected cases multiplied. While they couldn't dispute the documented evidence of supernatural phenomena, they questioned whether federal resources should be devoted to cases that might represent voluntary disappearances rather than traditional crimes. But Sarah remained convinced that understanding these cases was crucial for both law enforcement and grieving families. If people were indeed choosing to abandon their earthly lives in pursuit of impossible reunions, society needed to understand the psychological and supernatural factors that made such choices seem preferable to continued living. Her breakthrough came when she received a package from an unexpected source, a woman named Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne, who identified herself as a professor of parapsychology at a private research institute in Northern California. Dr. E.T. Hawthorne claimed to have been studying similar cases for over a decade, and she possessed evidence that the supernatural network Sarah had discovered was part of a much larger phenomenon. According to Dr. Hawthorne's research, human consciousness possessed capabilities that mainstream science had barely begun to explore. Intense emotional bonds, particularly those involving family relationships, could create what she termed psychic bridges between individuals that persisted even after physical death. Dr. Hawthorne had documented hundreds of cases worldwide in which living individuals had maintained contact with deceased family members through dreams, visions, and what appeared to be direct communication. In most cases, these contacts remained limited to brief exchanges of comfort or information. But in rare instances, the psychic bridges became strong enough to allow for more substantial interaction, including the possibility of living individuals choosing to join their deceased relatives in alternate planes of existence. The phenomenon appeared to be accelerating in recent decades, possibly due to increased emotional stress in modern society, or changes in human consciousness that science had not yet recognized. Dr. Hawthorne's institute had been quietly monitoring the growing number of cases, trying to understand the mechanisms involved and the implications for human understanding of life, death, and consciousness. Sarah arranged to visit Dr. Hawthorne's institute, hoping to gain insights that might help her predict and possibly prevent future disappearances. The facility was located in a remote area of the Mendocino coast, surrounded by redwood forests that seemed to amplify the sense of otherworldly mystery that permeated the research being conducted there. Dr. Hawthorne proved to be a woman in her 60s with the intense focus of someone who had dedicated her life to exploring phenomena that most academics refuse to acknowledge. Her institute housed an extensive library of documented supernatural cases, sophisticated equipment for detecting and measuring psychic phenomena, and several research subjects who claimed to maintain ongoing contact with deceased relatives. The most relevant aspect of Dr. Hawthorne's work was her study of what she called transition volunteers, living individuals who had been recruited by deceased family members to join them in alternate realms. According to her research, these volunteers underwent a gradual process of psychic preparation that could last months or years before they made the final choice to abandon their earthly existence. Dr. Hawthorne showed Sarah detailed case studies of transition volunteers, including psychological profiles, documentation of supernatural contact, and in several cases, final communications from individuals who had successfully made the transition to otherworldly existence. The evidence suggested that the volunteers retained their consciousness and personalities after transition, but existed in a state that was fundamentally different from normal human life. Most disturbing was Dr. Hawthorne's theory that the transition volunteers were actively recruiting new candidates, using their enhanced psychic abilities to identify living individuals who possessed the emotional vulnerability and family connections necessary for successful transition. The supernatural network that Sarah had discovered appeared to be expanding systematically, with each new transition volunteer contributing to the recruitment of additional candidates. The implications were staggering. If Dr. Hawthorne's research was accurate, society was facing a phenomenon that could potentially affect millions of people who had experienced significant family losses. The promise of reunion with deceased loved ones might prove irresistible to individuals whose grief had made continued earthly existence seem meaningless. Sarah returned to Washington with Dr. Hawthorne's files and a growing sense that her investigation had uncovered something far more significant than a series of unusual missing persons cases. She was documenting evidence of what might be a fundamental shift in human understanding of consciousness, death, and the persistence of family bonds across dimensional boundaries. But she was also facing a professional and ethical dilemma. Should law enforcement attempt to prevent what appeared to be voluntary choices by grieving individuals to reunite with deceased family members? Did society have the right to interfere with decisions that might represent genuine spiritual evolution, even if those decisions resulted in the abandonment of earthly life? Sarah's contemplation of these questions was interrupted by a call from Detective Reynolds, whose voice carried an urgency that made her immediately alert. "Dr. Chen, you need to get back to Portland immediately. The Whitmore property is experiencing phenomena that are affecting the entire neighborhood, and we're getting reports of multiple new disappearances." Sarah caught the next flight to Portland, arriving to find the Whitmore family home surrounded by police vehicles, federal agents, and scientific equipment that suggested a major investigation was underway. The supernatural garden that had previously been visible only to family members and close observers was now manifesting phenomena that were apparent to anyone who approached the property. Detective Reynolds met her at the police perimeter, his expression grim as he briefed her on the developing situation. Starting 3 days ago, neighbors began reporting unusual lights and sounds coming from the Whitmore backyard. When we investigated, we found that the garden had expanded beyond the property boundaries and was affecting plant growth throughout the neighborhood. Sarah followed him toward the house, noting that the normally suburban landscape had been transformed into something resembling an enchanted forest. Flowers bloomed in impossible profusion along every street. Trees had grown to unusual heights overnight, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with ethereal energy that made normal perception feel inadequate. But most alarming were the reports of multiple disappearances from the surrounding area. 7 residents had vanished from their homes over the past 3 days, all of them individuals who had experienced recent family deaths. Security cameras had captured several of the missing persons walking toward the Whitmore property with expressions of joy and anticipation, but the cameras had then malfunctioned, recording only static during the crucial moments when the individuals had apparently entered the supernatural garden. Sarah approached the original garden area, now expanded into a space that seemed to exist partially in normal reality and partially in some other dimension. The roses that Charlotte had planted were now enormous climbing specimens that covered structures that shouldn't have been able to support their weight. And moving among the flowers were dozens of translucent figures, far more than just the Whitmore sisters who had originally manifested there. As Sarah watched, she could identify several of the recently missing neighbors among the ethereal figures in the garden. They appeared happy and peaceful, interacting with what seemed to be deceased family members in a reunion celebration that transcended the normal boundaries of life and death. The supernatural realm that had originally provided refuge for Charlotte and Emma Whitmore had apparently grown into a community space where multiple families could gather across dimensional boundaries. Dr. Hawthorne arrived later that day, bringing equipment and research staff from her institute to study what appeared to be an unprecedented manifestation of the phenomena she had been researching for decades. Her preliminary measurements suggested that the Whitmore property had become a stable portal between dimensions, with the expanding garden serving as a physical manifestation of the otherworldly realm that housed the growing community of transition volunteers. According to Dr. Hawthorne's analysis, the portal was continuing to expand at an accelerating rate, potentially affecting a much larger area if the current trends continued. The supernatural network that had begun with the Whitmore sisters was apparently reaching a critical mass that could transform the entire region into a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Federal authorities struggled with how to respond to a situation that had no precedent in law enforcement history. Evacuating the neighborhood seemed prudent, given the unknown risks of exposure to supernatural phenomena, but how could they explain to residents that their homes were being abandoned due to otherworldly manifestations that defied scientific understanding? Meanwhile, more residents were disappearing each night, drawn to the expanding garden by what appeared to be contact from deceased family members who had already joined the growing community of souls in the ethereal realm. Each new disappearance added to the power and reach of the supernatural network, creating a feedback loop that suggested the phenomenon might eventually encompass vast areas of the Pacific Northwest. Sarah found herself at the center of an unprecedented crisis that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality, consciousness, and human existence. The evidence she had gathered over months of investigation suggested that death might not be the absolute ending that human civilization had always believed, but rather a transition to a different form of existence where family bonds could persist and even strengthen. But the implications for society were potentially catastrophic. If significant numbers of people chose to abandon earthly life in pursuit of reunions with deceased family members, the fabric of human civilization could be fundamentally altered. The supernatural promise of eternal family togetherness might prove more attractive than the struggles and disappointments of normal human existence. As Sarah stood at the edge of the expanding garden, watching the ethereal figures of families reunited across the boundaries of death, she faced a decision that would define not only her career, but potentially the future of human understanding about life, death, and the power of love to transcend any obstacle. The Whitmore sisters had started something that was growing far beyond their original intention, and Sarah was one of the few people positioned to understand and possibly influence what happened next. The garden continued to expand each night, and with it, the community of souls who had chosen reunion over separation, eternity over temporal existence, and love over the fear of death. Whether this represented humanity's next evolutionary step or a dangerous delusion that threatened the continuity of human civilization remained to be determined. But one thing was certain: the world would never be the same after the night when 2 sisters refused to let death separate them and discovered that love truly was the most powerful force in the universe.